My name is Evelyn Marlowe, a 70-year-old widow who once believed that blood ties were unbreakable. That belief shattered the morning my son Adrian invited me on what he called a celebration cruise. His voice carried warmth I hadn't heard in years, and I clung to it like a starving woman clings to bread. "Just us, Mom," he said. "You, me and Claire. We want to toast your recovery." I wanted to believe him. After all, I'd just spent 6 weeks recovering from hip surgery, mostly alone in my condo, ignored by the very family I'd sacrificed everything for. Since my husband Samuel's death 2 years earlier, my world had narrowed to phone calls that never came, holidays where I was an afterthought, and memories of the empire he left behind, the billion-dollar technology fortune now tied to my name. That Tuesday morning I wore Samuel's favorite dress, navy blue with a simple pearl brooch. He always said it brought out my eyes. At the marina, the yacht gleamed like a floating palace. Adrian greeted me with a hug that felt hollow, while Claire stood on the deck, her smile sharp and glinting, like the edge of a broken mirror. For the first hour I let myself hope. We sipped mimosas as the shoreline of Maine faded into the horizon. Claire talked about renovations to the house I had signed over to them, my house where I'd raised Adrian, as if it had always belonged to her. And then Adrian started asking questions, soft at first, sharp soon after. Questions about my will, my trust, whether I'd considered simplifying things. Something in my stomach dropped, cold and heavy. Adrian poured more champagne than I could possibly drink. "Probate can be messy, Mom," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "We just want to make sure things are handled smoothly." I noticed Claire holding her phone at an odd angle, pretending to take selfies but angling the camera toward me. My words, my glass, my face, captured. They weren't celebrating me. They were collecting evidence. In that instant, a lifetime of love turned to ice. I remembered the power of attorney documents they'd pushed in front of me at the hospital, the ones they swore were temporary. I remembered my financial advisor going silent without explanation. And I realized, with a clarity that froze my bones, that my own son and his wife were staging me as an incompetent old woman. "Adrian," I whispered, setting my glass down carefully. "Take me back to shore." His mask slipped. "That's not going to happen, Mother." Claire moved closer, her voice sugar over venom. "You've been showing signs of dementia. We have it documented. Doctors agree you can't manage your finances anymore." The boat was silent except for the slap of waves against the hull. I saw the glint of steel in Adrian's eyes. Not love, not worry, but calculation. "You can sign now," he said, pulling out a folder thick with legal papers, "or we can make other arrangements." I stood on aching legs, clutching the rail to steady myself. "And if I refuse?" Claire finally smiled. Truly smiled. "Then you'll be remembered as a frail old woman who fell into the sea." Tragic but believable. The shove wasn't violent. Didn't need to be. One moment I was staring at the endless horizon. The next I was tumbling into icy water, my son's voice shouting behind me, "Mom." No. Fake panic for the neighbors no one could hear. Salt filled my throat, the Atlantic dragging me down like a stone. My dress tangled around my legs, my hips screamed with pain, and for a heartbeat I thought this was it. This was how my story ended. But survival is stubborn. I kicked off my shoes, clawed my way upward and broke the surface, gasping. The yacht was already turning away, a white ghost against the horizon. They weren't even pretending to save me. They left me for dead. As the cold gnawed into my bones, I spotted movement. A fishing boat, weathered and steady against the waves. A voice rang out, rough with years at sea. "Hold on, lady." Strong arms pulled me aboard. Captain Jonas Mercer, a man in his 60s with skin leathered by salt and sun, wrapped me in a coarse blanket. Beside him, his teenage grandson Liam stared wide-eyed as if I'd risen from the depths itself. "Hi, family," I sputtered through chattering teeth. "They pushed me." Jonas swore under his breath. "We saw them tear off. Didn't look back once. What kind of people do that?" "The kind who inherit everything," I whispered, though in my chest, something far fiercer than grief was beginning to take root. Not grief. Not fear. Resolve. Jonas radioed the Coast Guard. "This is the Blue Haven. We've pulled a woman from the water 12 miles southeast. Alive but needs medical attention." "No," I rasped, clutching his arm with trembling fingers. "Please, don't tell them I survived." "Not yet." His eyes narrowed, studying me the way only a man who's seen too much can. You running from more than seawater? Yes, I said, the word trembling like glass. But not the way you think. If they know I lived, they'll try again. I need them to believe I'm gone. Jonas was silent for a long moment, then keyed the radio again. False alarm. Just debris in the water. He glanced at me, voice steady. Sometimes doing the right thing don't look like following the rules. By nightfall, I was wrapped in borrowed clothes at a hidden bed and breakfast owned by a tough woman named Mrs. Lynn, who didn't blink when Jonas said I needed a place, off the books. She served me steaming broth and asked no questions. That night, while Adrian and Claire were likely weeping crocodile tears for reporters, I sat in a stranger's kitchen, my hands wrapped around a chipped mug, planning their downfall. Jonas promised to keep watch at the marina, his boat giving him reason to linger where Adrian kept the yacht. I stared at the steam curling from my mug, and for the first time since Samuel's death, I felt something dangerous spark inside me. They think I'm dead, I whispered. Let's keep it that way. For now. The news hit faster than I imagined. By morning, the internet buzzed with headlines. Heiress Evelyn Marlowe lost at sea in tragic boating accident. I sat at Mrs. Lynn's old computer, scrolling through articles that painted me as a confused, fading woman. Adrian was quoted at length, describing how I had been struggling with memory issues. Claire gave tearful interviews about her fears for my safety. They even published a photo, me at Adrian's birthday party, looking bewildered because no one had told me it was a surprise. Out of context, I looked fragile, lost. Exactly what they wanted. My obituary was already posted online. Beloved mother and widow of the late Samuel Marlowe, Evelyn passed peacefully after a tragic accident. In lieu of flowers, donations requested to the Alzheimer's Association. I slammed the laptop shut while burning my throat. Bastards, I muttered. Mrs. Lynn looked up from her knitting, her sharp eyes glinting. Planning something, dear? Oh yes, I said, my voice steady. Something very special. 3 days later, I stood hidden behind a maintenance shed at my own funeral, binoculars pressed to my eyes. Adrian and Claire, draped in black, accepted condolences with flawless performances. Friends wept, neighbors mourned, and yet the people who should have been there, my lawyer, my financial advisor, my accountant, were conspicuously absent. They weren't grieving. They were complicit. As I watched Adrian shake hands and Claire dab at false tears, one thought crystallized in my chest like ice. I may be buried in their eyes. But I wasn't finished. Not by far. The funeral ended with a polished flourish. Polished casket, expensive flowers, hushed violin music. Adrian and Claire walked away draped in borrowed sorrow, arm in arm, as though the weight of grief united them. I wanted to storm out from behind that shed, tear their masks away and scream the truth into every shocked face. But fury without proof is just noise. Instead, I followed Jonas back to Mrs. Lynn's. My mind replayed every detail. The absent professionals, the carefully chosen words in the obituary, the false donations to Alzheimer's. It wasn't just their greed at play. Someone was orchestrating this with them. Someone powerful enough to shape the narrative, erase suspicions, and plant seeds of doubt about my sanity. That night, I returned to the house I had once called home. The air was sharp with autumn chill as I slipped through the garden gate, roses I'd planted decades ago brushing against my coat. I still had a key, one Adrian had never thought to demand back. The house greeted me like a stranger. Expensive furniture where warmth used to be, refrigerators stocked with imported food, the kind of details that whispered of permanent occupation. But it was Samuel's study that stopped me cold. Papers sprawled across the desk, a timeline marked in bold letters. Project Evelyn. My own life reduced to bullet points. My supposed decline mapped with chilling precision. Doctor visits staged, surprise parties designed to confuse me, even my medication bottles tampered with. Each incident documented like evidence in a trial. My trial. My execution. Hands trembling, I photographed every document with the disposable camera Jonas had given me. Anger blurred my vision, but rage gave me strength. Each paper screamed betrayal, not just from Adrian and Claire but from someone else. A letter signed with initials, MT. The timeline must accelerate. Evelyn is asking too many questions. Move to phase 3 within 2 weeks. Phase 3. My death. I shoved the papers back as headlights swept across the windows. Voices at the front door. Adrian and Claire returning, laughter in their tone. I darted through the back hallway, my heart pounding. As I slid into the garden, their words carried clearly through the night air. Peterson cried harder than anyone, Claire said smugly. No one suspects a thing. And the will? Adrian asked. Probate opens Monday. MT says we'll have control of the accounts in 6 weeks. I froze mid-step. A baby's cry pierced the silence from inside my former home. Baby. Adrian and Claire had never mentioned children. They had always claimed to be too focused on their careers. My stomach knotted as realization struck. This wasn't only about killing me for money. There was someone else they were hiding. When Jonas picked me up, I sat in his truck with trembling hands, whispering the truth aloud for the first time. They have a baby. His knuckles whitened on the wheel. And something tells me that baby isn't theirs. At dawn, we developed the photographs at a quiet one-hour shop Jonas trusted. The evidence was damning. Forged medical records, staged notes of my confusion, financial spreadsheets showing how my fortune would be spent. But one paper struck me harder than the rest. A birth certificate. Infant Marlowe. Born 3 weeks ago. Mother, Claire Marlowe. Father, Adrian Marlowe. It was a lie. Claire hadn't looked like a woman recovering from childbirth when she'd pushed me into the sea. She'd looked radiant, calculating, untouchable. This baby wasn't hers. That night sleep evaded me. I lay awake in Mrs. Lynn's guest room, staring at the ceiling, replaying the baby's cry in my mind. My son had plotted my death, but now there was a child, an innocent, caught in their web. By morning my decision was clear. I would not just expose their greed. I would uncover the truth of that child. Jonas looked doubtful as I spread a local map across Mrs. Lynn's table. They'll have to take the baby somewhere. A sitter, a nurse. Babies can't just vanish for 8 hours while their parents play mourners. Mrs. Lynn, polishing a teacup, finally spoke. I know someone. Discreet. Professional. A private investigator named Daniel Cross. He owes me a favor. I hesitated. Expanding the circle meant risk. The fewer who knew I was alive, the safer. But then I thought of that baby. His wail echoing through my stolen home. Call him, I said. Daniel Cross's office sat above a sandwich shop, modest but meticulous. He was in his 50s, prematurely gray, with eyes that missed nothing. So let me get this straight, he said after listening to my story. You want me to follow your son and his wife, find out the truth about their mysterious baby, and identify who this MT character is? That's right, I said, sliding an envelope of cash across the desk. Samuel had insisted years ago that I keep emergency funds hidden, for a rainy day. I suppose surviving attempted murder qualified. Daniel nodded. 2 weeks of surveillance. I'll need addresses, photos, anything that helps. I gave him everything. The documents I'd stolen, the birth certificate, the photographs of Adrian and Claire with Miranda Torres's names scribbled on the margins. He studied the forged paperwork with a magnifying glass. This MT handwriting's distinctive. I've seen it before. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. And here's one more thing, Mrs. Marlowe. If these people are as dangerous as you say, we need a safety plan. You check in every 12 hours. If you don't, I take everything straight to the police. I agreed, though a cold shiver ran through me. That night, while Adrian and Claire believed I was ashes in the Atlantic, Daniel began watching. And for the first time since Samuel's death, I felt I wasn't fighting alone. Daniel didn't disappoint. By the second day, he laid photographs across Mrs. Lynn's kitchen table like playing cards, each more damning than the last. Your son's been busy, he said. Meetings with lawyers, trips to the bank, but this caught my attention. He tapped a photo of Adrian and Claire entering a sleek glass building. Whitmore Reproductive Services. Elite surrogacy clinic. Very expensive. Very secretive. The blood drained from my face. So the baby. They bought him, Daniel said flatly. 8 months ago. Paid in cash. Fake birth certificate arranged in advance. Designed to look like their biological child. Mrs. Lynn slammed down her teacup, eyes blazing. They killed you for money and bought a baby for legitimacy. Devils. Daniel nodded grimly. And I've identified MT Miranda Torres. Estate attorney. specializes in helping wealthy families transition assets. She's worked with multiple families in Boston who suddenly lost elderly relatives under suspicious circumstances. A photo slid across the table. A sharp-faced woman with auburn hair shaking Adrian's hand. Recognition chilled me. I'd met her months ago at a charity gala. She'd been so curious about my trust structures. Too curious. Daniel's voice hardened. She's orchestrated this before. 6 cases I can confirm. Probably more. Always the same pattern. Dementia claims, sudden accidents, greedy heirs. My hands shook as I gripped the photo. Adrian hadn't just betrayed me. He'd partnered with a killer. And unless I acted, they would raise that stolen baby on the ashes of every life they'd destroyed. I stared at Miranda Torres's photo until my vision blurred. A professional killer wrapped in a lawyer's suit. She'd turned elderly families into prey, disguising greed as compassion. The thought made bile rise in my throat. But the worst part wasn't her. It was Adrian. My son. My only child. He hadn't stumbled into this. He had sought her out. He'd welcomed her venom, let it drip into his veins until he believed murder could be repackaged as mercy. Daniel leaned back, his eyes shadowed. We've tracked her for years. But she's careful, never leaves fingerprints, always has plausible deniability. She hides behind grieving families like yours. Not anymore, I whispered, rage steadying my hands. That night Mrs. Lynn poured us all tea as if to anchor us. So what now? She asked. I swallowed hard. Now we make them believe the ghost of Evelyn Marlowe has come back for them. The plan began with a letter. Elegant stationery, Samuel's fountain pen. Dear Adrian and Claire, reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated. We need to talk. Love, Mother. Daniel arranged for a courier to deliver it to Torres's office during their morning meeting. We waited in Jonas's truck across the street. At 11:47 a.m. the messenger entered. At 11:53 Adrian and Claire came bursting out of the building, their faces white with panic, Torres snapping orders into her phone. Mrs. Lynn chuckled darkly. Psychological warfare. Perfect. I leaned back in the seat, my heart beating like war drums. The hunt had officially begun. That afternoon I returned to my former home. Not as a victim but as an intruder in plain sight. Carol Peterson answered the door, a nurse in her 30s with tired eyes and cartoon scrubs. She blinked at me as though she were staring at a ghost. Which, in a way, she was. Hello, Carol, I said softly. I'm Evelyn Marlowe. I believe you're caring for my grandson. She froze, bottle in hand. You're dead. I saw the news. Everyone. They lied, I interrupted gently. And if you let me in, I can prove it. Inside, the baby cooed in a bouncy chair. My breath caught. A perfect little boy, only weeks old, dark hair like Adrian's but eyes too serious for his age. My chest ached as I bent to touch his tiny hand. What's his name? I asked. Robert, Carol whispered. At least that's what they said. But sometimes they call him Baby Marlowe, like he's an object. I turned to her. Because he isn't theirs. His birth mother was a 17-year-old girl named Sarah Collins. She died during delivery under suspicious circumstances. They bought this baby and killed me to secure his inheritance. Carol's face crumpled as tears welled in her eyes. She glanced at the infant, horror dawning. What do you want me to do? She asked. Help me protect him, I said firmly. Take notes. Photos. Document everything. This child deserves truth, not lies built on blood. For the first time in days I felt hope flicker. The next morning, Daniel spread more photographs across Mrs. Lynn's kitchen table. Jonas leaned in, smelling faintly of salt and diesel, while Carol sat stiffly in a corner chair, baby Robert cradled in her arms. Your son's panic is showing, Daniel said. He's making mistakes. I followed him yesterday to another meeting with Torres. They're accelerating their plans. He handed me documents, probate filings claiming I'd died without a valid will. According to them, Adrian and Claire were the sole heirs. The will I had signed just 2 years ago had been quietly replaced by a forgery. I scanned the paper, bile rising. They left everything to themselves with provisions for future children. That's why they bought the baby. To legitimize their claim. Jonas slammed his fist onto the table. This isn't greed anymore. This is organized crime. Daniel nodded grimly. Exactly. Torres has orchestrated at least 6 similar cases. Elderly targets, suspicious deaths, heirs who inherit smoothly with her legal cover. This isn't about one family. It's a network. Mrs. Lynn's knitting needles clicked furiously, the yarn jerking in her hands. Then we don't just fight for you, Evelyn. We fight for everyone she's destroyed. I looked at Carol rocking the baby, her eyes still swollen from crying. He gurgled softly, utterly unaware that his short life was already stained with murder. I reached for him, holding his tiny body against my chest. Then let's give them what they don't expect, I whispered. A war. By the end of that week the stage was set. Daniel had wired my former home with hidden microphones and cameras. Carol had agreed to stay, her role now doubled as caretaker and witness. Jonas lingered near the marina, watching for Torres's movements. My task? Walk straight into the lion's den. The evening air smelled of rain when Adrian opened the door. He paled as though the dead had risen, which in his eyes I had. Hello, darling, I said pleasantly, stepping past him as though nothing had changed. Claire stood in the living room, her face collapsing into a scream so raw it almost pleased me. Surprised? I asked, settling into my favorite armchair, the one Samuel had given me on our 20th anniversary. The reports of my death were, it seems, premature. Carol appeared carrying baby Robert. Mrs. Marlowe asked me to bring the baby, she said softly. Claire's voice cracked. He's ours. You can't. Is he? I cut in. Because the last time I checked you weren't pregnant. Tell me, Claire, did you name Sarah Collins before or after she died on that operating table? The silence was deafening. Claire's eyes flashed with fury. Adrian opened his mouth but no words came. I rocked the baby gently, my heart a steady drum. This child is not your heir. He's evidence. Evidence of your greed, your lies, and your crimes. Their masks were crumbling, piece by piece. Exactly as I wanted. I laid the photographs across the coffee table one by one. Adrian and Claire shaking Torres's hand, entering Whitmore Reproductive Services, signing forged documents. Each photo a nail in their coffin. This is Miranda Torres, I said, pointing to the auburn-haired woman in the images. She's not just your lawyer. She's a predator. And she's killed more people than you can count. Claire tried to recover her poise, her tone sharp as a blade. You can't prove any of this. Oh, but I can, I said calmly. And I already have. Every word you've spoken since I walked through that door is recorded. Adrian's eyes widened. You recorded? Yes, I said. Massachusetts is a one-party consent state. And guess who the consenting party is? Claire's face twisted, her mask of sophistication snapping into rage. Then what do you want? Money? Silence. I stood holding Robert close. I want my fortune back. I want this baby raised with the truth. And I want Torres in prison for the monster she is. Adrian's lips trembled. And if we cooperate? Then maybe, I won't press attempted murder charges. But fraud, conspiracy, accessory to Sarah's death? Those are beyond me now. That's the law's domain. They sat frozen, hollow shadows of the family I once knew. I almost pitied them. Almost. You have 24 hours, I said coldly. Choose wisely. But deep down I knew. They would not choose wisely. They chose poorly. At 6 in the morning my phone, a cheap burner Daniel insisted I use, rattled across Mrs. Lynn's kitchen table. Daniel didn't waste time on greetings. They've been on the phone with Torres all night, he said. She's bringing in a cleaner. The word sank like a hook beneath my ribs. What kind of cleaner? The kind who makes problems vanish and leaves coroners with tidy words like accident and misadventure. Flight from New York lands at 9. They want to stage you somewhere public for maximum plausibility. Jonas was at the door within minutes, smelling of sea and urgency, a truck idling behind him. Mrs. Lynn stuffed cash, IDs, and a rolled packet of documents into my bag with a speed that betrayed long practice at helping people disappear. You'll use the island, Jonas said. A friend owes me. 1 cottage. 1 dock. No neighbors. On the run again. 70 years old and learning to live in the margins like a thief stealing back her own life. The boat cut across gray water, wind tearing at my hair and eyes. I watched the coastline shrink, A thin line between the world that wanted me dead and the world where I still had a say. Daniel met us at the dock an hour later with the tight, restless energy of a man who'd slept in his car. "It's worse than we thought," he said inside the cottage, maps and photographs unfurling across the table like a second shoreline. "Torres isn't a one-off. She's a hub. Elder targets, motivated heirs, compliant professionals. I can tie her to at least 20 questionable deaths across New England." Mrs. Lynn bent over a photograph, her brow knitting. "This woman. I saw her at the hospital where I volunteer, asking which older patients didn't get visitors." Her voice hardened. "Scouting. We were no longer fighting a family's greed. We were fighting an ecosystem that fed on it." I pulled a blank notebook toward me and started writing. Everything I could remember, every date, every conversation, every time the room had spun because a pill bottle wasn't what it said. If I vanished again, the truth would not. Outside, gulls screamed. Inside, resolve settled like iron. They had hired a cleaner. So would I. Only mine would cleanse the entire rot, not the evidence. By noon, Daniel's phone lit with a code word text. He read it, jaw tightening. "Change of plan," he said. "The cleaner is dead. Hotel room. 1 bullet. No witnesses." "Torres killed her own man?" Jonas asked. "Loose ends," Daniel replied. "She's purging anyone who can link her to operations. If she suspects Adrian and Claire might panic and talk, she could cut them too." I waited for the familiar pulse of maternal terror. It didn't come. What filled me instead was a cold, shameful relief. Let them taste the dread they served. Then a new horror hit. Baby Robert. "An orphaned infant with a forged pedigree," Daniel said softly, reading my face. "He's a liability to her narrative. A crib can catch fire. A furnace can fail. Carbon monoxide does not leave witnesses." I stood so fast my chair skidded. "We go now." "It's a trap," Jonas warned. "They'll be watching the house." "Then we give them something better to watch," I said, and the plan fell from my mouth as though it had been waiting there all along. Daniel listened, then nodded once. "Risky. But if she thinks she's interrogating a live witness, if she starts to monologue, we might get what we've never had, her words on tape." We turned the cottage into a war room. Daniel parceled assignments like a conductor setting cues. Jonas handled exfil routes and a secondary boat stashed in the reeds behind my old street. Mrs. Lynn coordinated with Carol, who, shaking but steady, agreed to remain with the baby and to open the servants' entrance if the house turned into a snare. I memorized the placement of every hidden mic Daniel had wired into the woodwork, every camera tucked into air vents and book spines. He pressed a slim recorder into my palm. "Insurance," he said. "On body capture. One-party consent." I thought of Samuel's handwriting on old letters, of Adrian's first bike ride, of the day I signed the deed to my house over because I believed that love was an asset safe from theft. "The house, the money, the name," I said. "They can take all of it. The baby and the truth never." Daniel glanced at his watch. "Torres will be on the road by 3. Be at the house by 6. We want them nervous. We want them sloppy. We want them honest," I corrected, and for the first time since the ocean I smiled. At 5:57 p.m., I stood on the front steps of the house where I had once diced onions for 1,000 dinners and kissed 1,000 hurts. The key slid into the lock like muscle memory. The air inside smelled the same, polish and paper, but the feeling had changed. My home had been staged to look like a museum of me. Adrian opened the living room doors with a face I recognized only from photographs. My son at 10, caught between guilt and defiance. The man superimposed on that boy looked bruised by fear. "Mom," he said. The word stumbled out and looked around for someplace to hide. "I'm here," I answered. As arranged. Claire paced behind him, her manicured calm sanded to splinters. "She'll be here soon," she said without meeting my eyes. "Miranda." "First names now," I said lightly. "How intimate." Adrian flinched. "We never wanted." "But you wanted enough," I cut in. "Enough to call a stranger who sells endings to frightened children." He closed his mouth on the rest of whatever lie he'd planned. Carol moved like a shadow at the threshold, baby Robert dozing against her shoulder. The sight of him, that unknowing peace, nearly undid me. "Thank you," I mouthed. She nodded, already shifting toward the back stairs. The servants' passage Daniel had reopened in dust and secrecy. I sat in my old armchair because ritual matters. I placed my palm on the worn wood as though blessing it goodbye. Daniel's mics listened from the molding. Jonas's truck idled 3 blocks down, engine ticking. Mrs. Lynn was 2 houses away in a borrowed sedan, knitting resting in her lap like a prop for a part she had to play. At 6:59, tires whispered on the street. A door clicked. The house seemed to inhale. Positions, Daniel's voice murmured in my ear from the smallest mic, the one pinned like a pearl at my collar. We're live. I straightened my dress, folded my hands and waited for the spider. Miranda Torres was smaller than I remembered, compact and precise. A woman who looked as if she could fold herself into any room and become the sharpest thing in it. She smiled as though greeting a donor at a gala. "Mrs. Marlowe," she said, extending a hand. "Your survival complicates matters." "Good evening," I replied, ignoring her hand. "Sit." She did, opening a leather portfolio as if we were negotiating a contract for flowers rather than a method for killing me. "Let's speak plainly," she said. "You've caused distress to my clients and risked destabilizing instruments worth considerable value. But I am not unreasonable. There are options that preserve dignity." "Whose?" I asked. "Yours." She tilted her head, amused. "You have a wit. I've always liked that in the older set, what remains of their personality shines as the confusion grows." "Tell me," I said, letting my voice feather into curiosity, "how many confusions have you resolved?" Her eyes flicked to Adrian, a warning to stay silent, then back to me. "In the past 5 years," she said, consulting a page without really looking, 37 families have found peace through our guidance." 37, I repeated. The number landed like a stone in a well. "We expedite the inevitable," she continued, voice gentle, almost pastoral. "We spare good people the prolonged cruelty of decline. We convert chaos into order." "You convert parents into payouts," I said. "And when a teenage girl dies birthing a baby you sold, what do you call that conversion?" A seam opened at the corner of her smile. "Collateral," she said softly, and for a heartbeat the room went so quiet I heard the recorder hum. Claire made a strangled sound. Adrian stared at his hands. Miranda's gaze stayed on me, clinical and bright. "You are unusually resilient, Mrs. Marlowe. Most accept what is offered. Few fight. None survive long." "Until tonight," I said. She leaned back, lacing her fingers. "You won't leave this house alive." The baby stirred somewhere in the bones of the building, a whisper of breath over the floorboards, and it took everything I had not to look toward the sound. "Talk to me about the logistics," I said, steady. "I like to understand what will be written in the papers." Her eyes warmed, pleased with the pupil. "Furnace," she murmured. "An old line. Carbon monoxide. Mercy's quiet hand. 37 murders dressed as maintenance failures." Behind the bookshelf, a camera blinked. I could have waited longer. I could have asked her for names, for dates, for the price of a conscience bulk build. But there are moments you feel the air change. The second before a storm, when the pressure drops and birds fold their wings. We were there. I stood. "Miranda," I said, smoothing the front of my dress as if for church. "One last thing." She arched an eyebrow. "Yes. You should know." I let the smallest smile touch my lips. "You're under arrest." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Adrian's mouth fell open. Claire's eyes sliced toward the foyer. Miranda's face did not move at all. Then the house detonated into sound. Front door. Back door. Windows. Floor vents that had only ever breathed heat spat agents in dark jackets. Voices braided into a single command. "Federal agents. Don't move." Miranda spun, not toward flight but toward me, calculating even now whether a body between her and the stairs would buy seconds. She didn't get them. 2 agents pinned her arms. A third wrenched the portfolio and a thin gun I hadn't seen from her bag. Claire froze. Adrian started to rise and then seemed to forget how legs worked. An agent, calm, precise, a woman with eyes like tempered glass, stepped forward. "Miranda Torres," she said, cuffs flashing. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, elder abuse and racketeering." The room flooded with new angles. Badges, lenses, the low blink of recording lights confirming what my caller mic already knew. Behind me, somewhere below, a door eased open. Carol executing the plan, carrying the small life we'd arranged this hell to protect. I exhaled for the first time in hours. Miranda turned her head just enough to find me. You think this ends it? No, I said. I think this starts it, with your confession and my testimony. Her smile came back, thinner, crueler. Then may the courts be kinder than I am. Tonight, I said as the agents moved her toward the door. They already have been. The house, my house, finally sounded like a place where truth might live. And somewhere above the noise, a baby sighed and drifted back to sleep. The house became a hive of controlled chaos. Federal agents swept through every room, cataloging documents, seizing electronics, photographing evidence. For the first time in years, the space felt like it belonged to justice rather than deceit. I sat at the dining table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea Mrs. Lynn had pressed into them, watching Adrian and Claire being read their rights. They looked small suddenly. All their designer clothes and curated confidence stripped away in the fluorescent glare of truth. One of the lead agents, a woman named Sarah Chin, turned to me. Mrs. Marlowe, you've done something extraordinary. Without your courage, this case might never have broken open. Miranda Torres has evaded us for years. I wanted to feel proud, but the weight of betrayal pressed heavier. Extraordinary, I whispered. All I did was survive my own son. Carol appeared in the doorway, baby Robert tucked against her shoulder. His tiny yawn was louder to me than the shuffle of boots and radios. I held out my arms and she passed him to me. His warmth sank into my bones. For the first time since Samuel's death, I felt life return to me, not as wealth or property, but as something simple and human. Love. Torres was led past me in cuffs. She didn't struggle. She only tilted her head as though studying me like a specimen. You won this round, she murmured. But networks don't die with one arrest. I held the baby closer and met her gaze. Then we'll keep fighting until they do. The trial stretched for months. Miranda Torres stood in a federal courtroom, her cool detachment cracking only when the recordings played, her voice calmly admitting to 37 resolutions. Each word, each number was another nail in her coffin. The jury deliberated less than a day before returning with guilty on every count. Murder, conspiracy, fraud, elder abuse, racketeering. Life in prison without parole. Adrian and Claire fared little better. They pled to lesser charges: conspiracy, fraud, accessory to the death of Sarah Collins. 25 years for him. 20 for her. I listened to the sentencing from the gallery, my face an unmoving mask. He tried to meet my eyes once, lips trembling as though he wanted to mouth sorry. I looked away. Some things shattered too completely for apologies to mend. The aftermath was wider than I imagined. 17 others fell. Probate judges, corrupt doctors, heirs who had played their parts too eagerly. A web of greed cut apart strand by strand. Newspapers called it the inheritance conspiracy. I called it proof that evil rarely hides in monsters. It hides in suits and smiles. Through it all, baby Robert remained with Carol and me. The court system moved carefully, aware of how delicate his existence was. DNA tests confirmed what we already knew. He wasn't Adrian or Claire's. His birth certificate was a forgery. But finding his true lineage proved harder. The name Sarah Collins surfaced eventually, traced to a shelter in Maine. 17 years old. Alone. Dead in childbirth. Except the medical staff whispered she shouldn't have died at all. I cried that night, harder than I had since Samuel's funeral. The baby in my arms was living proof of a girl who'd been erased. I promised him through my tears that he would never forget her name. Part 23. The adoption hearings were mercifully swift. Perhaps the judges saw in me not just a widow but a woman who had clawed her way back from betrayal and refused to let an innocent child become collateral. I stood in court. Robert nestled against me in a navy blanket, Samuel's old tie draped over my arm as a symbol of the family he came from. His name, I told the judge, is Robert Samuel Collins Marlowe. Robert for the grandfather who would have adored him. Samuel for the father who built a legacy. Collins for the teenage girl who gave her life to bring him here. And Marlowe because I will raise him with truth, not lies. The judge's gavel came down with a smile. Approved. Outside, reporters swarmed, hungry for photographs of the billionaire widow who rose from the dead. I shielded Robert from the flashes, refusing to let him become another headline. He was not a symbol. He was a child who deserved a life unshadowed by greed. At home, Mrs. Lynn baked a cake in celebration, Jonas grilled fish at the dock, and Daniel stopped by with a rare smile. For the first time in months we laughed. Not because the war was over, it never truly is, but because hope had space to breathe. That night, as Robert slept in the crib we'd set up in Mrs. Lynn's guest room, I sat beside him, whispering stories of his mother Sarah. I told him she had been brave, that she had loved him even before she saw his face. And I promised him he would grow up knowing her name, not as a tragedy but as a light. Years passed like pages turning in a heavy book. At 72, I found myself sitting in the garden of Mrs. Lynn's bed and breakfast, still her fortress, though now with a quiet side business helping seniors who suspected their families might not have their best interests at heart. Jonas still captained his fishing boat, but tourists now booked him as much for the legend as for the catch. The man who pulled a billionaire out of the Atlantic, they whispered. He'd wink and tell them he only fishes for the stubborn ones. Daniel, Agent Cross as I had to remember now, sent Christmas cards. Photographs of elderly people he'd saved, families reconnected, fortunes protected. Sometimes his handwriting was hurried, but the gratitude in those faces needed no words. And Robert, my Robert, was 5. Bright-eyed, curious, already stubborn in the best ways. He knew his story. He knew his mother Sarah's name. He asked about her sometimes and I told him the truth, that she had been young, brave and tricked by cruel people. That her love lived in him. Adrian wrote from prison. Letters heavy with excuses, apologies, half-truths. I never replied. I could forgive many things, but not a son who measured his mother's life against the weight of money and found her expendable. Claire never wrote. Silence was her final weapon. But the silence didn't matter anymore. The world I'd rebuilt was louder, full of laughter, of Robert's questions, of Mrs. Lynn's stubborn kindness, of Jonas's gruff humor. Family, I had learned, isn't about blood. It's about who pulls you from the sea. I sometimes wonder how I survived that week. The plunge into icy water, the betrayal of my son, the shadow of Torres's empire pressing down. Perhaps it was stubbornness. Perhaps it was Samuel's memory keeping me afloat. Or perhaps it was the knowledge that some stories cannot end unfinished. 5 years later, the scars remain. Adrian and Claire still sit behind bars, their fortunes spent on lawyers who could not undo truth. Torres rots in a concrete cell, her empire dismantled, her name a cautionary tale in law schools and ethics seminars. Me. I rise each morning to Robert's laughter, a sound brighter than any legacy Samuel or I could have left in bank accounts. We sit in the garden, he and I, watching gulls wheel over the sea. Grandma, he says, tugging my sleeve, tell me again how you beat the sharks. And I tell him, not about the ocean, not about the betrayal, not about the $1 billion. I tell him about Jonas and his boat. About Mrs. Lynn and her soup. About Daniel and his relentless search for truth. About Sarah, the mother he never met but who gave him everything. Family, I whisper, brushing his hair back, isn't about who shares your blood. It's about who shows up when the waves try to take you. Robert nods, satisfied. He doesn't yet know how deep those words cut, how much they cost. But one day he will. And when he does, he will know he came from love, not greed. And that, more than any fortune, is the legacy I leave behind.